Welcome to Basic Black. Some of you are joining us on our broadcast, and others of you are joining us on our digital platforms. I'm Kristen Pope, your host. Tonight, Hispanic and Latin culture. There are more than 800,000 Latinos who call Massachusetts their home. Some reports estimate that number is much higher. But as we recognize the history and contributions in art, music, food, and entrepreneurship, we cannot overlook issues from ongoing challenges around K-12 education, housing to health disparities, and economic instability that impact our Latino brothers and sisters in the Commonwealth. We have a great panel this evening. Joining us tonight is Dr. Celina Miranda, Executive Director of the Hyde Square Task Force, Dr. Lorna Rivera, Director of the Mauricio Gastón Institute for Latino Community Development and Public Policy at UMass Boston, Beyazmin Jimenez, Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Culture at Northeastern University, and Betty Francisco, CEO of Boston Impact Initiative and co-founder of Amplify Latinx. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us to have this conversation. I'm excited, and I first want to set the stage with a bit of history. I would like to give some context to the Latino community here in the Commonwealth. Dr. Rivera, Lorna, can you start us off? Can you kick us off with a bit of history about Latinos here in the Commonwealth?
Yeah, well, you know, Latinos are not just recent immigrants in our Commonwealth. We've had Puerto Ricans, you know, second, third, fourth generation now that came to Massachusetts, primarily to the Connecticut River Valley, and really working in places like in Southbridge and in Holyoke and Springfield as agricultural workers. So Puerto Ricans have been in the area and have been and continue to be the largest group. But we also have a considerable number of Dominicans. And Dominicans came here, a lot of them after the Trujillo, administration there, and settled in, Jamaica Plain and also in parts like in Lawrence and other areas that also were these gateway cities where there had been a lot of deindustrialization, and so people were also moving from New York here, so Dominicans, Puerto Ricans also coming from New York to Massachusetts. But then in the 1980s, with the different military interventions in Central America, we saw a large number of Salvadoreños coming, Hondurans, Guatemalans, and so those are some of the largest groups that we have in our state. And in places like Waltham, you have a large number of Guatemalans there. You'll see concentrations as well of South Americans, like Colombians, a large number of Colombians that also settled in, the Merrimack Valley. But I have a real presence as well in places like in East Boston. So what distinguishes us from other parts of the country is that we're not just Mexicans, right? We're very diverse, and diverse in terms, again, of our histories, our cultures, what brought us here, and the kinds of contributions that we're making.
I so appreciate you breaking that down, that Latinos, like other ethnic groups, are not a monolith. Betty, can you talk to me a little bit? What are some of the groups, the different, to piggyback off of what you said, Lorna, what are some of the groups that are here that maybe is a misconception to people who are, looking at the Latino community? What are the groups of Latins that are here?
Yeah, as Lorna mentioned, in the United States, the predominant Latino group is Mexicans. But in Massachusetts, it skews first to Puerto Ricans. Lorna and I are both Puerto Rican, but I'm also mixed. I'm Chinese and Puerto Rican, so we have this diversity within the Latino community where it's multi-ethnic as well, then followed by Dominicans. And I think the difference is, a lot of them tend to skew more highly educated as well. There's a significant professional Latino community here that's formed. One of the things we we focus on too is increasing political representation, and so that is growing in Massachusetts. The Latinos still do skew for across the country and also here into they're overrepresented in some of the service professions. And so that is what contributes, right, to seeing more of them start businesses, be very entrepreneurial, but in spaces like hospitality, restaurants, tourism. And now, there's also a growing focus on getting more Latinos into higher ed, into technology, into professions where they can increase their economic mobility and educational attainment so that we increase Latino prosperity in the state.
And I wanted to talk about thriving. How is the Latino community thriving in this space? Right before I do that, though, I want to talk about the microcosm of Latinos that are right here. You talked about the different groups, but ladies, if you can share your background. You spoke, Betty, about being biracial. So if each one of you could share with our audience, what is your background?
Well, I'll start. I grew up in New York City, but my mom is Puerto Rican. My father's Chinese. But I grew up mostly with my mother, and I went back and forth to Puerto Rico. So I did 1st through 4th grade in PR. That is why I learned Spanish. And my mother always ensured that I spoke Spanish in the home. And so having that culture in your home and making sure you speak the language was a big part of how I grew up. And then education played a critical role, right, as well. So a lot of Latinos focus on ensuring their children are going, through high school and then to college, but often without a lot of resources, right? So we kind of figured it out. But that was the pathway, right, to being able to go to college, law school, and then business school for me.
That's fantastic. Yeah. Bea, tell me your background a little bit.
Absolutely. I am Dominican and Haitian. I arrived when I was 4 years old, so I was born in the Dominican Republic. And I learned, actually, by happenstance that my grandfather was Haitian. And so I've been making sure that I bring that bond together because it's very important to me. I'm first generation, and so the first one in my family to go to college, and we've been able to really thrive here in Massachusetts, and I'm really grateful for the community that I found in my hometown of Lawrence, actually. And then I moved to Boston about 10 years ago, so now this is also my city.
That's fantastic. Celina?
Yes, so I am originally from El Salvador. So I was born in El Salvador. I came to this country when I was 10. And it's, I think, worth noting that I was undocumented when I came. So in terms of my future and what that path would be was uncertain up until the amnesty of 1986, which is when my parents were able to get their documents, and then, therefore, I was able to get mine. And so that changed my trajectory, but I grew up in California, Southern California, and then went to Smith College, which is what brought me to Massachusetts, and I've been here since in Boston, the Boston area, since '97 after graduating from college, and I have my PhD from BU, School of Social Work.
Thank you. Lorna?
Well, my family came from Puerto Rico to Chicago and New York through a program called Operation Bootstrap in the 1950s, which was one-way tickets to come and work in industries here in the mainland of the continental U.S. So that history also of military service. My father was in the Army, so he came to Chicago when he was 21, and he met my mom on the South Side. So I'm really proud to have gone to Chicago Public Schools, became a teacher, and then I came here to Boston to go to graduate school at Northeastern University. But I am the first generation, really proud of that. And also, like Betty, I went back and forth. There were no after-school programs for us. They put us on a plane, whenever there was school vacation. You could fly for free if you were under 12 on Eastern Airlines back then, 1970s. And so I was able to really maintain that bilingual connection to my family that still lives mostly in Calle, Puerto Rico. So, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, all of you, because that's a microcosm of Boston, of the Commonwealth. I heard a lot of, immigrant stories. Celina, can you share with us, the migrant population here and kind of the picture of the migrant experience that is happening that that some people may not understand?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's so complex, right? Because when you think about sort of that experience of migrating to the country, there's sort of the whole language acquisition piece, right? You're coming to a place where you don't speak the language. You have to learn that. And for children, there's a whole impact of that, because for many of us, like, we quickly, because of where we are developmentally, we catch on with the language quicker, and then we become the translators for our family. So there's a lot of, I think, stress that gets put on children, and we don't think about that. There's also sort of the documented status, right, documentation of, am I able to work, am I able to provide, and what am I going to be able to do? And even the journey that for some of our young people, as they're navigating what that means for them and their future, I always think about sort of the parallel experience that I've had, where up until the age of 16, I had no idea if I was going to be able to go to college. I was doing really great. I was a wonderful student, getting A's and doing really well. But whether or not I was going to go to college was a question, because this was before the Dreamers, came about, and before it was okay to speak about that undocumented status. So I think the migration part is such an important part of our stories, and that is whether I think you are Puerto Rican or not, because sort of like that going back and forth. Whereas for me, I wasn't able to go back to El Salvador for many, many years, and in fact, I had loved ones who passed away that I couldn't partake in the ritual of saying goodbye because I couldn't travel, and the uncertainty that you have to go through, and the way that sort of you see your parents sort of fighting for survival. That's the other part that we don't think about, and what that does for children in many ways. I mean, I remember my parents sort of working, my mother cleaning 3 houses a day, my dad working in factories, and it wasn't until he became an entrepreneur himself that our life changed a bit. But that was just sort of over time, and it took many years to get to that point. So I think there's a whole complexity of our stories that don't often get told.
Absolutely. And there is a point where your family, or at least you, went from, let's say, maybe survival to some level of thriving. And Bea, you talked about that you have been able to thrive. Talk to us about what that looks like for, an immigrant, and what it looks like in the Latino community to be thriving.
Absolutely. Well, I would be remiss to say that education played a major role in that. I think me being able to enter college was eye-opening for my family, and then made it much easier for my younger brother. And by the time he became of age to enter college, at that point we understood how to apply for scholarships, and he was able to really thrive in that, in knowing how to access resources that were available to him. And so you saw a major difference. By the time my brother went to college, our family was much more established and understood more what was available to us. And so education did become a pathway for my family. And similarly, in my network, as more of us became of college age, we were sharing experiences. I was able to study abroad. And so being able to then bring that back to my family and even share our story of how we were growing in the U.S. with family back home was a source of inspiration for all of us.
Yeah. Thank you, Bea. Betty, education, so important. Economic viability, so important. You play a role in that, in your role at the Boston Impact. How does this tie into the ability to thrive here in the Commonwealth?
Yeah, so, the Latino community here in Boston and in Massachusetts and in the country, right, it's the fastest growing demographic. It also, from an economic perspective, we in the U.S., we love to talk about GDP. Latinos, as of 2021, we provide $3.2 trillion in GDP. We contribute that. And the Latino Donor Collaborative has a study that shows that if we were a country, we would be the 5th largest country in the world. So the economic contributions from a consumer perspective, right, it is significant. Latinos also are the fastest demographic starting businesses. We're extremely entrepreneurial. Out of the women-owned businesses that get started in the country every year, 6 to 7 of them are started by Latinas every year. So it is a huge, contributions from an economic perspective that are being made. Economic growth is strong. but yet there's still barriers, right, that our Latinos face. Latinas, for example, right, we talk about the gender pay gap. October 5th, right, was the demarcation of Latina Equal Pay Day. So it's the day we pick to show how long Latinos have to work to earn the same amount as the average white man, and it's almost 2 years, right? So even though we're the most entrepreneurial, we contribute to many of the economic decisions, the buying decisions in our homes, and we're raising children, right? We're contributing to our societies. We're leading in terms of economic and educational attainment as well, right? Yet Latinos get paid 52 cents on the dollar. And so the loss of that income over a 40-year career is like $1 million. What could you do with that $1 million?
Absolutely.
Right? So it's buy a home, send your kids to college, achieve, right, yourself, college attainment. And so that is part of the work that we're doing at BII, which is helping entrepreneurs of color in order to start businesses and get access to capital and resources they need to get that, you know, sort of friends and family money that often they don't have because of a lower start in terms of the asset base.
And the bigger picture is that this benefits everyone, because you're talking about the contributions, the size of the Latino community. Celina, I wanted to talk briefly about, you know, what the presence of the Latino community means for Boston, because you've taken part in making sure that the presence of the Latino community is cemented here. What does that presence mean?
Yeah, no. So, you know, as part of our work at Hyde Square Task Force, we're the managing partner for an area of Boston that now is recognized as Boston's Latin Quarter. And while, you know, there have been some folks who's like, why that particular area, you know, it's not East Boston, et cetera. The reality is, historically, when you look at the importance that the Hyde-Jackson Square area had in Boston as a receiving place, right, as a place where you can walk and all of a sudden there's a taste of home, whatever that home meant for you. Actually, Jamaica Plain was my first place my first stop out of college when I moved to Boston, and it's where I could get plátanos maduros. I hadn't for years in Northampton, Massachusetts, been able to get plátanos maduros, and I could go and do it. And so that became such an important place. And for us, our work is what, you know, folks are talking about as placekeeping rather than placemaking, which I think it's an important differentiation.
That's interesting. I've not heard the difference between the two.
So when you think about placemaking, it almost assumes that something's not there. It's from a deficit orientation, as opposed to coming at it from a strengths-based perspective and really building on what's been there. And it's over 60 years of history in the Hyde-Jackson Square area, where primarily at some point it was Puerto Ricans, it was Cubans, and now it's primarily Dominican. But it's where you can get your Dominican pastries. You can go to your barber shop, and they're going to know what to do with your hair, right? There's all these things that happen. It's a place, and it's a place that has meaning. And for us, we're focused specifically on lifting up Afro-Latin arts and culture, because it's a part of our history. It's a part of our story that doesn't often get told. And we think it's important primarily for the young people who participate in our program, which are mostly Dominican. And so for them to know, where did I come from? And that sort of helps you figure out where you're going.
And this matters. It matters that you have a place that you can feel like is home, that you can take ownership of and then share with other people to shape that narrative and to help other people see why investment is important. And so, Bea, we're moving into, you know, the taste of the Latin community. Talk to us about the importance of the art and the entertainment and what and the culture.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, when I decided to move to Boston, I looked for Jamaica Plain, and I live in Jamaica Plain now. And it's for all of the reasons that you mentioned, Celina, the food and being able to get my hair done, or being able to even just see folks that look like me in a city that we know has often invisibilized us, right? Made us feel invisible. Even as we know that we make so many contributions to the city of Boston and beyond. And so for me, absolutely, I think even us being here today is very important, being able to share that we come from a very mixed heritage. I think it's important because we often only see one type of Latino in the mainstream. And so being able to share that yes, we have multiple ethnicities within our construct, and that many of us are very proud of being Black Latinos as well. And so I often say to folks, you know, I'm Black and I'm Latina. It's very important for me to be able to show up in a space and say, that's what I'm bringing forward. That's what makes me me. That's what makes me unique.
What does the history, like connecting what Bea said about, again, the culture, the diaspora of the Latino community, what does that mean for us historically? What you know where the Latino community has been and where it's going, and what we are expecting to see here in the Commonwealth.
Well, it's a very young population, so that's the main issue. We just did a report on second-generation Latinos. The Gastón Institute produced this research, and we are seeing some positive gains in that second generation in terms of educational attainment, but there's still some real challenges there in terms of some of the poverty rates are still really high, and, you know, really this question of Afro-Latinidad, like we're really grappling with that in our own community, you know, of anti-Blackness and representation. And I think this younger generation, though, is affirming more of that, you know, Afro-Latinidad, that identity as Black and Latino. So there's also a need for our curriculum, our school curriculum, to affirm, you know, our histories, and that's also happening more often. And organizations like the Hyde Square Task Force, with their mission, and Sociedad Latina and others, like we also need this in our school curriculum to learn these histories, so that we understand that that we're not that monolith, as you mentioned. But understanding those very distinct cultural differences. I think about the Guatemalan community here has more of an indigenous identity. They don't speak Spanish. Many of the Guatemalans in Waltham, I mean, there's 32 different dialects of Mayan Quiché, and yet, you know, we don't really even look at not just the racial diversity, but also the linguistic diversity, and that's something I think that people are affirming more. We saw with Indigenous Peoples Day in Newton. That was an incredible celebration, and we had like Taino groups also represented there. So I think it's, you know, we're this next generation, you know, we're more proud. We're not trying to hide, and you know, we're here, and we're not going anywhere.
I want to let all of you, and I know that's right, you're not going anywhere, okay? No, the Latino community is growing and has this gateway of the ability to thrive. And so I wanted to hear from all of you, we have about 3 minutes left, about what does the Latino community need to thrive? Like you said, there are some issues. We've talked about education. Each one of you can take about 30 seconds to talk about what does the community need to thrive.
So earlier in the year, Amplify Latinx did a poll of Latinos. The first time Latinos were polled to see what were the top issues for them and what do they want their state leaders to focus on. So the top two issues were housing affordability and healthcare access and affordability. Then jobs and addressing unemployment. Education was fourth, right? So what it tells you is home ownership and affordable housing is key to having stability. You need that. And we're in one of the highest cost, rent, you know, is so high in Massachusetts. We're the second highest rent burden state. And then Latinos, I think 50% of Latinos in Boston are what we consider rent burdened. So focusing on housing and affordability, and then a pathway to ownership, because we know that when you build equity...
And it's interesting because those are basic needs, right?
Correct, yeah.
Well, I think political power is critical, because without public policies and being at that table to, you know, shape these decisions around what should be funded, what are our priorities, we have made some gains there, right, in terms of our elected officials, but we have a lot more to do in that area.
Okay, political power.
Yeah, I would add that continued investment in education, as you've heard in terms of the stories, right? For many of us, that has been sort of what has allowed us to thrive just here around this room. And so to continued investment in opportunities in dismantling the barriers that get in the way for our young people to be able to achieve.
Thank you, Celina.
And for me, I would say sharing our stories, sharing our culture, no longer assimilating, right? Instead, showing up exactly and uniquely as we are. I think that really matters, especially in this moment in time.
Thank you all. This has been a phenomenal conversation. I think you all have given us so much context, history, depth, color about the Latino community that we don't often get to sit and have these kind of conversations, but I believe our audience is going to be really enlightened, and Boston is better for it. So thank you all. That is the end of our broadcast and the end of our show. Thank you for joining us. Now, stay with us as we continue this conversation on our digital platforms, YouTube and Facebook. I'm Kristen Pope, your host, and we are on YouTube and Facebook with our post show, continuing our discussion on Hispanic and Latin culture. And so some of the things that we determined that, we're going to bring in this particular segment was about what is needed. What are some of those specific things that are needed? Betty, I wanted you to share with us, what are some of the specific things that the Latin community needs to thrive?
Well, a big piece of the data shows that Latinos want to build their assets. They want to build wealth. And one of the fastest ways to do that here is through home ownership. But it's also having affordable housing, being able to save so that you can then, buy a home and also send money back. We talked about, a lot of us still have family in our home countries and we want to go back and retire. So that's one. Two is business owners. We're extremely entrepreneurial. So access to capital is a huge need, and friendly capital that works with you and supports you, gives you resources and technical assistance, advice, coaching that you need to thrive as a business owner. Healthcare, affordable healthcare, and education access as well. So Latinos are growing in numbers in terms of educational attainment, but there's still barriers in terms of cost, in terms of access to the kinds of higher education institutions, right, that are going to give you those opportunities. And of course now, with the Supreme Court's affirmative action decision, we can't underestimate the impact that will have on more Latinos and people of color going into higher ed.
Would you say that creates another barrier?
Absolutely.
Okay. Speaking of education and our young people, Celina, talk to us about how important the youth voice and presence is and how you work with them to secure that Latin quarter.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's critical. I think so, oftentimes not, just in general, we underestimate the power of young people and their voice. And that's one of the things that we do well at Hyde Square Task Force. We've been working with young people, partnering with them, and they were critical in the advocacy that got us to the recognition of our neighborhood as Boston's Latin Quarter. They went before the Boston City Council, they advocated, they presented before them, and they got unanimous vote. And then they were also instrumental in helping us go before the Mass Cultural Council so that our neighborhood was recognized as a formal cultural district in the Commonwealth. So we're one of 40 plus cultural districts, but we were the only one up until recently that was ethnically focused on preserving and uplifting the contributions of the Latino community. But we couldn't have done it without our young people. And I think that's the part that we don't need to think of them as into the future, but we need to think of them now. And what is it that they can do to make our communities better?
That is powerful, right? Like not into the future, but a right now present asset. Lorna, what's the significance of that precedent? The precedent of this being recognized as an ethnic space by the mass culture. What's the historical and the significance of that?
Well, it's huge because, our community has been so invisible, really, so-called in the shadows. But we don't have that representation. And what's also happening in Jamaica Plain is, there's some beautiful murals too, right, that are representing. I mean, this is happening in Lynn and in the South End, and certainly that cultural expression of telling the stories, the new mural by Roberto Chao at Mozart Park, it's like highlighting, right, our leaders like Jose Mazo, right? So we're really trying to also, strengthen, right, this, not just in the Latin Quarter, right, but like how do we also, have our broader representation in all of the neighborhoods where we live, throughout the Commonwealth. I did want to add that one of the things that was mentioned earlier too, as an asset is also our linguistic, capital, and many of our Latinos are coming from professional backgrounds, but not being able to use those credentials in our workplace. So we don't have reciprocity around diplomas, for example. If you're a nurse or you're a doctor, you're coming here from Colombia and you were a doctor, there should be some, pathway, right, to get the credential here. And so we're doing a study on that, funded by the Latino Equity Fund, to really look at immigrants and their credentials and what are some policies that we can put in place to accept, those diplomas and those credentials, or have a fast track, have more English classes, because we do have we have a lot of cultural wealth, but we're just not tapping into that as much as we should be.
Bea, you mentioned being a translator, you were a translator when you were a young person, and to Lorna's point, there's that you have cultural capital in being able to speak another language. Do you feel like it's valued, like you have that as a value?
Absolutely. I would love to share that with young people, that our language is an asset. Right, just as Dr. Rivera has been mentioning, it's something that does bring us more opportunity in the workplace. It's something that I'm able to utilize to connect even better with the folks that I'm working with, and even outside vendors who want to work with the university. Me showing up as a Latina and being able to kind of share that cultural capital with them, it makes the conversation much more interesting. And so I absolutely want to uplift that our language, our culture, our heritage, all of those things that oftentimes have made us feel like the other. Actually, it's what is being called on right now for us to utilize as we're entering in this moment where we really have an opportunity to transform our city, just being who we are.
And I'm going to stay there for a moment because you also talked about, and we ended on sharing stories.
Yes.
Sharing the stories, creating the narrative is so important and powerful. How important is it to shift and change and shape the narrative?
I would say it is important because who tells the story matters, right? And so, no one can tell our stories better than us. And so even if it's, sitting and having cafecito with your abuela to find out more about your family history, I'm recently doing that myself. Just like digging through old photos, or even just coming back to like spiritual practices that have been in my family for generations. I'm now relearning them and bringing them back in because I'm noticing that these are tools that actually our ancestors left us with. And they're just as important as some of the academic learning that I've had. I would say that in Boston in particular, one of the things that I would love to see is more civic spaces for Latinos to congregate, to gather, to share stories, to share music. that's why it was very important to have this designation of the Latin Quarter as a place for us to gather, to connect, to share stories. Just like Betty was saying, oftentimes you get started on an idea and it's your friends and family who hear it first. And so if we're not having opportunities to connect, then oftentimes we're just kind of working on our own and not feeling as supported as we can be if we do it in community.
I do want to touch on the fact that there was a restaurant that did close or was closing. Celina, can you talk about that and kind of the impact that was felt with that?
Sure. So, the news just became public this week, of recognition that an institution, El Oriental de Cuba, which has been a critical place of gathering, not just the food. The food is part of it, but it really is a gathering space where many of us, casually ran into each other, met there for meetings, and actually some of our elders in the community would gather every day around 8 o'clock. You could see them there having their cafecito. And so you think about the importance of place and what this meant has meant for the community for over 40 years. And now the closing of it is something that it does hit you, hard, because you recognize, yes, there are other restaurants, but no, not another one like El Oriental. And it's a shame that, the forces that be and everything that happens as you think about, particularly, I think, small businesses run by a Latino community, that they are so busy trying to survive and trying to thrive that they don't have the time or space to think about succession planning. So what happens when that founder, that person who dedicated their whole life to making that business work, is no longer around? And that's the story of El Oriental. Unfortunately, the family could not keep the business going.
Wow.
So it's a huge loss for us.
So to you, Betty, how do we protect that while building the assets, building the wealth? How do things like that, institutions, get protected?
So to that story, right, El Oriental de Cuba is an example of what we call the silver tsunami, right? It's the businesses that are now in their second, third, sometimes fourth generation, these family-owned businesses, where perhaps the newer generation doesn't want to run them anymore, cannot run them anymore. And there isn't, right, a bench there for succession. And so identifying that this is happening all across the country, but particularly with, family-owned businesses, there is an opportunity to do what we call conversions to employee ownership or cooperative ownership, because the goal is to keep them in their place, right? Place, it matters so much, so maintaining them local and continuing the jobs that have been created over the years is vital, right, to economic stability of an area. And so Boston Impact is part of an initiative called the Northeast Transition Initiative, which is to identify these silver tsunami type of businesses and start to work with them early on to go through the decision-making process, right, of how do we convert them to employee ownership. That could be a 5, sometimes it's a 10-year road, because you need to change the way decisions are made. So you have what we call participatory decision-making, open book management, right, where employees understand and know the finances of this business, and you're building a different culture so that employees can actually take it over and own it and build wealth that way as well.
I have to tell you that I feel so enlightened. I feel like we have done such a service. The things we're adding, the silver tsunami, this is my first time hearing about it, but that's good to know about and good to know that that's happening and that there is support and already a plan in place to kind of get ahead of that. Ladies, this has been an incredible conversation. I want to end it with each of you giving some final thoughts to our audience. We've talked about a lot of things, but I would like to give it to you for what you would like to leave. So, Celina, I'll start with you.
I think where I would start is sort of noting that there is sort of that diversity. I think it's important to know, right, we're not a monolithic group, but also the cultural wealth that we have as a community. I think that's important. It's what we try to focus on in terms of our work at Hyde Square Task Force. Having our young people tap into that and recognize that they have so much to contribute in the now and into the future, and that our young people are critical sort of change makers, and we need to sort of partner with them as we strive for a better future for our community.
Absolutely. Lorna?
Yeah, well, I just want people to know that, I said it earlier, that we're here and we have been here and we're going to be here. And so, really accepting that and being more inclusive. I think our country has been, very anti-immigrant and, really just, kind of having more tolerance and acceptance is needed more than ever, right, in our country. And so I just think really accepting, right, and trying to have more, bilingual and multilingual, and it just really, again, embracing that diversity as a strength, and it's not a deficit. Even if our children in our schools are not English speakers, they know, like, they have intelligence.
Yes.
And so I think, just really recognizing and embracing our diversity is important.
Thank you. Betty?
If we want to have economic prosperity and competitiveness in this state, we have to help the Latino community advance. And, this is the workforce of the future. It is, the community that is going to be embedded throughout every institution. It's the one driving economic and entrepreneurial activity. And so it's worth the investment, isn't it, right?
Yes.
To build, the resources needed to help this community thrive. So I would say, for leaders in particular, don't take your eye off this community. In fact, invest in it, double your investment in it, and you will see your payback in multitudes.
That's good wisdom. Bea?
Learn your story, learn your history. I think everyone here has shared how important that is, and I think us being able to own our narrative, I think, is going to be the key to our future.
Fantastic. Thank you, all of you, for sharing your history, your story, your transparency, your wisdom. We appreciate it. This is the end of our show. I'm Kristen Pope. Thank you.